Welcome to CGT Square Talk, where top experts in the industry share their groundbreaking journeys. Brought to you by BlueSquared, your strategic digital partner.
So this week is a little different format because we don't have a guest. We have 4 BlueSquared team members who went to the LSX conference in Boston just last week, actually. Seems like longer, but it was just last week. Anyway, we thought it might be interesting to just kind of chat about our experience and what we thought of the conference and and anything else that's on anybody's mind, I guess, in terms of cell and gene. And as I said, I'm not feeling so hot today, so my brain may not be fully with us. Anyway, we've had Gary on before. Hey, Gary.
Hi.
A little wave. But Ian is new. He's our head of product at BlueSquared. So first impressions, what'd you guys think? I loved Boston. I love the North End. I appreciate Gary taking us around since he's a local. Thank you for that. And the restaurant, I didn't know that I was going to be in the middle of a Martin Scorsese movie when we went to the restaurant that you recommended, but between the opera singing and everything else, it was a great experience.
Oh, good.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. That was
for
great.
that. So anybody, what was that?
It was good to see all of you at the in Boston and to show you around. And yeah, we had a good dinner the first night, and I'm glad you enjoyed the second night as well.
Yeah,
absolutely.
No, it was good. It was definitely good. So conference,
good history lesson too.
Yeah,
good history lessons.
Exactly.
Well, for me at least. But yeah, about the conference, I think it was great. It was geared, in my opinion, mainly towards upcoming companies that are trying to raise money. So there was a lot of talk about, how to raise money, a lot of talk about acquisitions and mergers and what these companies should look for and so forth.
Yeah.
There were some.
No, go ahead, finish.
Yeah, there were some good points about the medicines as well, right? So the product, what other people are working on, and how to get to market. So
yeah,
from that perspective.
Yeah, that was interesting, right? Where they were talking about how some therapies or some market areas which weren't very popular, say, I don't know, 4 years ago, have become much more popular, or have a probability of success in the market now, right? Where they can do some shifts. And you make another really good point. So one of the things that they were talking about a lot was how some of these companies, some of the funders will actually start them out, let's say in Europe or in Asia, because it's less costly to kind of go through the initial stages of a trial and initial stages of getting, getting a therapy kind of up and running, and then kind of an arbitrage opportunity to come back to the US when they're actually going to raise, larger amounts of money, which I thought was kind of an interesting view.
Yeah, it was really interesting. Following up on that is the focus on the small biotechs and the funding and the corporate venture capital that like a Novartis or a J&J is really like looking at these smaller companies. I pulled a stat that said 4 in 5 approved drugs for these big pharmas originated at a small company, originating outside of their company. So, and that is in the whole landscape, not just in cell and gene. So I imagine the numbers even higher in cell and gene, that these big pharmas, like over 80% of it is not in-house innovation.
Which is great. And they get ingestion from these big companies, right? So they get funding from these big companies, and in my opinion, it's great news for the smaller companies. It allows them to go through trials of their product and trying to figure out whether it works or not, and everything else much faster, because it's much easier to move a smaller boat than a big boat, right? So, and if this would be happening at these bigger companies, it would be a lot more, a lot more harder or longer, I would say, probably more expensive to do this.
Yeah, well, there's no doubt they're kind of looking at acquiring, right, to augment their portfolio. Absolutely. And to grow the portfolio.
Yeah. And what's interesting about that too is they said that they're acquiring more often like the late stage companies, companies that are going into phase 3 or in phase 3 or marketed, but that there's actually a higher return on rate from the early stage companies, even with the higher rate of failure because early stage. That one of the finance guys says, like, even with factoring that in, the early stage investments yield better results for the bigger companies. So I don't know if we're going to see a shift or not towards them being a little bit more risk taking in looking at like a phase 1 or preclinical, but he seemed to sort of like indicate that might be a direction, which is interesting too.
Yeah. Gary, I think you may have gone on some different tracks.
Yeah, I was mostly on a technology track.
Yeah. What were your impressions?
When I knew there would be AI there, I suppose I was a little bit surprised at just how much AI there turned out to be in the end. I went to AI sessions, and I went to sessions that had nothing to do with AI, and yet that's what we seem to talk about. And I think what surprised me a little bit was, well, it's not actually heavily used at the moment. There is obviously a lot of ambition, but the data is siloed, sometimes by treatment center, by hospital. It isn't looking very positive that we'd be able to exchange that data to get the kind of large language models or things like that we're seeing today. And the real main wins at the moment seem to be in the area of helping doctors renew their licenses and certifications, helping patients fill out the form accurately and correctly. There's lots of challenges, even if they could solve the data siloing issue. We talked a lot about bias in the data, and that it's difficult, almost impossible, I think one of the speakers said, to eliminate. So I didn't come away from the conference feeling terribly hopeful that AI is around the corner, but I do feel, in my opinion, that's a world that we really need to get to. I think there's so much that could be happening with AI that could help us all as human beings on the planet to do things better, to live better, and things like that.
Right.
Other things jumped out at me that.
Wait, before you
sure.
do that, I'm just kind of curious because you talked about the bias a little bit with the current data sets so what's the issue there? What's kind of the negative pieces? Obviously, bias always kind of comes with a negative connotation, but what's the real impact?
If you look at someone who perhaps is homeless, or someone who's living with a family, and getting that data into the system is skewed towards the person who lives at home or has a family, and therefore it doesn't necessarily jump out when you're analyzing their data that their circumstances are difficult or different. And there's a lot of that, but it's not enough to move an AI model in the direction where you would want to see it considered.
So is that because they can't register those folks, or what's the blocker there?
It's population sizes. It's statistical analysis at the end of it. The norm overrides the exception, and somehow you have to skew that model. And like I said, one of the AI experts said, "I'm just going to be upfront with you and say it's almost impossible to fix this problem."
Right.
But that's just an opinion. It may not be. There may be ways where you can intervene on a model and skew it towards something, to skew it in favor of more of these exceptions and try and normalize it a little bit more. But it certainly wasn't very hopeful.
And
I want to piggyback on that.
Yeah, go ahead, Armen.
I want to piggyback. Yeah. You said normalizing. So this is the thing that was jumping out at me, right? Data normalization and data point normalization between all of these companies. That, first of all, they're not sharing any of the data, right? All of the data is very siloed. Most of the companies are keeping that data to themselves.
Well, don't they see it as a proprietary kind of?
Yes, absolutely. But also, at some point, data normalization, in order for the AI to help and to start working in favor, data normalization has to happen. Everybody has to look at the data from the perspective of the same way, and possibly start sharing data. And because people are not really sharing data, yes, absolutely, there is a lot of IP that is there that people don't want to share. But unless all of that happens, in my opinion, it's going to be really, really tough for the to utilize the AI to advantages, right? I mean, just thinking it from that perspective.
Gary, I was going to ask you, well, two things. Now that Armen said that, it made me think of something else. But the first thing was the exception cases that you were talking about. How impactful is that if it's not there?
Well, another example, I think, which I think you can see that more clearly, is the fact that if you're in a clinical trial, you have a much better chance of getting in if you live near one of the treatment centers versus a rural location.
And that's come up a lot
Yeah.
in context, like especially with like say the apheresis and the CAR Ts. It's like if you're 6 hours from an apheresis center.
Yeah.
So that came up in the other conference too when we went to ISCT and talking about how can we get these centers that are rural licensed and qualified so that more people can participate in trials. I mean, I know we're segueing away from the AI talk, but it's
no. So you were saying, so basically you're saying either you get more centers qualified so that there are more opportunities, but they're also talking about having like mobile manufacturing, like pods, let's call them that, right? For lack of a better term, right? Which can kind of move around, and patient access, is definitely a big thing.
Yeah, I mean, the other area that hit me was the ability of the person to take their own blood sample, for example.
Oh, yeah.
Tools that are now, and devices they can be sent to enable them to do that. Now, unfortunately, for a lot of the cell and gene therapy stuff, there's sometimes a surgery involved. So it may not ever work for our area, but things like wearables, future planned devices, but also existing devices that we carry around, watches and cell phones, are being actively used today for even Parkinson's, which was really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And in my mind, I'm starting to see an event-driven architecture. I'm starting to see logistics, business exceptions, things like that, all being generated directly from the patient's device that they're wearing.
So do you think, going back to your AI data problem, the wearables, I mean, are we talking like, the big guy, the Googles, the Apples, are gonna, if they're not already, I mean, they're already moving into the space, of course, but are they, is that a way to kind of get more access to the data? Because they cut across, obviously, sponsors or providers, right?
Well, some of it's regulatory and some of it's just that. I think someone said, Brigham and Women's is never going to talk to Mass General, right? Now, that's not regulatory. That's anti-competitive. Well, that's a strong word, but it's competitive, right?
Right.
I think the bigger players, the Googles who deal in data, would be very motivated to share. Apple, I'm not so sure. They tend to view themselves as a walled garden, and I'm not sure if they would. But I wouldn't rule it out. I think it's a possibility. I mean, let's look at the latest watch. It now detects sleep apnea.
Yeah.
I think a great change would be a CGM, a continuous glucose monitor, in one of the watches. It would be an incredible insight for all of us when you see what happens to your blood when you eat 2 slices of pizza, for example.
Well, even the external glucose monitors, and you bring up a great point. Active patient monitoring post injection of the therapy, right? Yeah. So the patient has to be actively monitored and seeing what the changes are and everything else. And in a lot of cases, in order to do that, they have to go back to the doctor's office. Yes. They have to go back to the hospital. Now, if there is devices out there, if there are any devices that are, measuring glucose levels or any type of other, I mean, if it can measure glucose levels, it can probably measure some other stuff in your blood, right? And that would be very advantageous to the patient itself, make it easier.
Yeah, so I think, somebody talked about that, the move to decentralized trials, meaning like people don't have to come into the clinical site for these monitoring things, that really started to take off during COVID. And I think that Parkinson's one was interesting because it was like basically you take your phone and you hold it out and it uses the gyroscope to see like how much tremors you have or not, or you flip it, and that they could detect if somebody who had Parkinson's, the wrong patient or somebody else in the family was using it, because all of a sudden it would go from like tremors to like perfectly fine. They're like, okay, statistically it's not possible. So it was interesting to get like that perspective of not only like how accurate they can measure, but also that they could detect those anomalies. And it was like, oh, that's just an interesting use case of how you can. Yeah, I just thought it was really interesting.
Yeah, they could in real time to monitor someone's progression through Parkinson's as well, just by even monitoring the way they walk and the change.
Right, the gait. Yeah.
I hope I'm around long enough to see all of this come true, because I think it's going
to be moving rather
is
quickly.
going to be very different, very, very different.
Well, the progression nowadays is everything is getting quicker and quicker and quicker, right? Hopefully AI will help us not just from the side of the, analyzing data and everything else, but also progressing the technology, that it can help with the technology progression, right? So to make this happen, hopefully faster.
But I heard a lot of people being cautionary too. It's like, okay,
Yes.
AI, it's good buzzword, but it's a tool. Let's make sure we're not just throwing this tool into like every possible use case we can think of, because it's really just appropriate in certain use cases.
That's kind of happening all over the place, right? I mean, I think I said this to Sanjay last week. You drive through San Francisco and every billboard says AI on it, right? Whether it's no matter what it is. So.
Yeah, I think in 5 or 10 years we'll look back on the doomsayers and also the optimists, and we'll find their takes quite amusing. I think it's going to be something else and something better than what either of them are envisioning at the moment. I think, I don't know, this isn't quite technology relevant, but I was surprised as a person living in this country at the number of rural healthcare centers that are closing down. And I talked to some of my colleagues in Europe, and it's actually quite similar. They're seeing the same things in France as well, for example, that a lot of rural health centers are closing down. This, of course, will drive a lot of the things we've just talked about, these improvements. But still, nevertheless, I was quite surprised at that kind of shift.
What did they say, your friends overseas? What was the driver there? Or what is the driver?
It's the same as here. It's cost.
It's cost. It always comes down to $1, unfortunately, right?
Or a euro.
Yeah. So then patient
or euros, yes, absolutely.
Or pound, since those guys are all on an island unto themselves now. I was just talking to somebody in the UK yesterday, and he was like, "Ugh, it's so hard for me to travel even." Anyway, one of the things that I think is interesting, because I went to a session where they were talking about certainly fundraising, because that seemed to be the focus of it, but then also kind of partnerships, right? And how you can really benefit from different types of partnerships, paid partnerships, if you can work a deal out like that. And there was something that when we were talking to Sanjay the other day on that podcast, collaboration, right? This ability, it kind of goes to what you're talking about in terms of sharing data. So, okay. And he was saying that they're not there yet, right? Everything from the way the technology is built today, they're still kind of using the same old paradigms to build software. And I remember our friend at EY was saying kind of the same thing, right? This idea of collaboration, where you really need everybody to kind of participate and to collaborate, and that's what's going to make this, successful at the end of the day. Did you guys pick up on any of that in any of your sessions, or was it mostly just kind of financial or talk about AI?
Yeah, there was. So it was interesting. I went to a talk about speeding up, streamlining clinical trials, and it was interesting because there was another talk happening at the same time in a different track called speeding up clinical trials.
Wait, what was the difference?
One was from like the med tech one. It was something about like it was called streamlining clinical trials
versus speeding up. Okay.
And the other one was about speeding up clinical trials for faster cures for all. And I was like, I was like, this is an interesting example of how this silo group is not talking to this silo group, because they have like almost the same session happening or same topic, but they were pretty much at the same time, and you had to choose one. And I was like, this is an interesting example of just that, of like the lack of collaboration or insight. But they, but the people still felt pretty siloed.
Well, they are, I think, right? Even in our space. So wouldn't you say, though, on the cell and gene side, especially autologous therapies, the clinical trial is a little bit, in some sense, faster just because of the science itself, right? Because the earlier stages are trying to make sure that it's safe, right? Which they still do. But because, they're taking, let's say, cells from a patient, and then, infusing those back into the patient, they get a real benefit right away, right? So they're kind of already going into what normally would be a further phase of a trial, but just by the fact that it's cell and gene, right? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, usually phase 1 trials are just based on, safety.
Right.
So in other phase 1 trials, they'll just give like a drug to completely healthy patients just to make sure it's a safe drug. But, with these cell and genes and cancer, they're not going to that. They're going to patients that are already sick. So they're basically starting in phase 2.
Right.
Most of the time.
Yeah.
That's a progression of its own, right? That's a speed up of its own. So you're kind of skipping a step. But I actually, I just thought of something else. When talking about streamlining, right? When in our world, in a software world, when we think about streamlining, and we're thinking about this, having some tools, introducing tools to streamline the process. So one thing is streamlining the actual trial itself, where the patient's involved, where the product is involved, and so forth. Another thing is streamlining the tool sets that are helping these companies to be able to kind of go through this faster. And I think that also there's an opportunity there where all of these companies are working on the tools, the manufacturing, the manufacturing process itself. So streamlining the entire thing so it could get faster and faster and faster and faster at the end of the day.
I mean, I think they're
Hopefully
trying to do that, right? Especially with autologous therapies, because it does take a while, and sometimes there's an unfortunate outcome with the patient before they can have the therapy manufactured. So I think you're right. I think everybody in the space is trying to do that. I think allogeneic is a little faster, but there's other issues with.
We've talked to other guests before where people are saying that a lot of the reasons where people are turning away or focusing on one rather than the other is the speed, right? Is how fast they can get this to a patient. And in a lot of cases, they're way too late, where you're right, the patient doesn't have enough time. And a lot of these patients are very sick, and they're in the very last phase of their progressive disease. So, the faster they can get it, sometimes it could be life-saving.
Yeah. So any other impressions, you guys, from this, or any impressions that you or anything that you kind of stumbled on that you can take back into your world on a day-to-day basis? Obviously collaboration is
I think that what I see is most of my work is centered around, we could just call it logistics. Getting the sample to the manufacturing and getting from manufacturing back into the patient's arm. It's critical that we do that. We execute that. We build software that does that well. We can never be the bottleneck, and we can only bring productivity to the process to speed that up. Now, every treatment has its own estimated turnaround time. We should make sure that everything we do optimizes that turnaround time and gets us there. Or if it doesn't, let's provide the analytic tools to provide the insights so we can see exactly where we're not making it. Does it get stuck in customs for 5 days?
Right. Yeah. What are the exceptions and the business events that are causing something maybe to be delayed where it doesn't necessarily have to be?
Actually, a good point. Removing the hurdles where you don't actually have to have these hurdles in the process, where you're already spending a lot of time in production and this and that. So it's like, let's make this as smooth as possible, and using tools by doing that, which is great.
But even silly things like making sure we assign things to the right patient, and put in checks in place and things like that. It's sometimes the basic things as well that could delay things a couple of days.
Yeah, well, some of that is necessary if you want to make sure you don't, in some therapies, you don't hit the wrong patient, right, when it comes back.
Yeah. Well, that's where the chain of identity comes in play, right? And this is probably the biggest and the most important thing in cell and gene world.
Yeah. Ian, any last thoughts?
I just want to have more trials running, and whatever we can do to. I think the biggest barrier is the cost still, right? The cost of manufacturing and running these trials. It's coming down, right? We couldn't do this 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But how can we continue to create, cost improvements, whether it's at the edges or in the core, so that we can have more trials and we can have less failures of the manufacturing or the shipment arrival. Wherever we can find those edges to speed up these trials and have more of them, it's going to just result in more benefits. So that's what I what we do. And
you're right. We were talking to somebody even this morning, right, about our philosophy is we're definitely into the collaboration piece of it, and from the software side, and how can we contribute to bringing the cost of per patient down, even if it's just, we deal on the infrastructure side, the software side, the services side, but what can we do so that can be translated either back into the research or making something more efficient or better patient access. I don't know. It's
right.
Yeah.
It's
I like that thought.
Yeah. All right, guys. Well, this has been fun. Hopefully people find it interesting and helpful. We're going to be at meeting on the Mesa, right? 3 of us, at least. Armen and Ian and myself will be there in Arizona at the first or second week, and I think it's the second week in October. So we look forward to that.
Absolutely. And we should probably do the same thing afterwards, right? So we should give our audience some of the scoop.
We certainly can. Why not? Yeah. And Gary, thanks again for being our host in Boston. We look forward to coming back again. And I do want to get a Sox game in, which we weren't able to do this time. But
okay. Sounds good, Ant. It was good to see you all.
Next time. All right, guys. Good to see you. Have a good weekend. We'll talk to you soon. Don't hang up.
No flipping.
Subscribe for more insights from leading CGT experts.